Thank you very much, Mr. Deputy. I'd like to, first of all, say a special good afternoon to all of the residents of Marco City and to once again express my appreciation for your continued support, your prayers, and your advice. I would also like to extend, Mr. Deputy, by way of you to our Speaker, sincere condolence on the passing of her brother, and to let her know that we have her in our thoughts and in our prayers. Today, I rise to give support to the Climate Change and Carbon Market Initiative Bill 2022. It is a bill for an act to give effect to the Paris Agreement and to aid in the global response to the threat of climate change, and to create and implement initiatives to offset carbon emissions. Mr. Deputy, before I look at a few portions of this bill, permit me in a very brief way to put in context how real this discussion is. Let me first say, in 2016, the team that I have the honor of working with, the very same team I met in place, who assisted multiple members of Parliament before me, diligently walked throughout the community of Grand Bahama, assisting residents in putting tarp on their roof, repairing homes that had been damaged by Matthew, provide resources for residents who needed help. The government at that time had not moved swiftly enough, and many residents were in dire need of assistance. Mr. Deputy, in the aftermath of catastrophic events, residents have learned to rely not just on government, but on faith-based organizations, NGOs, and others to provide assistance. And I recall the experience of 2016 vividly, because at that time I was preparing to be a candidate in the upcoming election. I recall the impact of others being on the ground faster than government agencies, and how that negatively impacted the later efforts of that administration. Persons received the help that eventually came, but they remembered the moments in the aftermath of that hurricane where help was scarce. Some would argue that we experienced a similar situation in the aftermath of Dorian in certain communities. The point I make, Mr. Deputy, is that when people are hurting, governments that are in the chair have an obligation to move, the word once again, with a sense of urgency. Sometimes governments make determinations to mitigate against the accusation of doing something illegal or unethical, to put systems in place. That's necessary, but not sufficient. When people are in dire straits, they need help with immediacy. It's not an unrealistic expectation, Mr. Deputy, especially since we live in a hurricane alley and Bahamians have a reasonable expectation that governments, being continuous, are fully aware of the potential for a catastrophic event, and therefore the necessity to prepare or to be prepared. And so I always find it amazing when administrations, all those that I support and those on the other side, when we get in rows, patting ourselves on the back for a response by our standards, wonderful, by public standards, something else, for doing a job that is consistent with our remit, with our mandate, with what we have been elected to do. I believe, and we believe, that it's important to plan in advance. This piece of legislation, similar to those passed in 2019 under the Minnis administration, those passed in 2020 and 21, are a part of our, hopefully, shift to planning in advance to mitigate against what is almost certain to be catastrophic events in the future. At the core of the discussion that we're having today about addressing the issue of carbon markets is how do we put our country in a position where when it is impacted by a catastrophic event, we are able to rebound on a timely basis in order to get the wheels of a national economy moving again. Where will we get the resources from in order to accomplish that end? So this bill is important in at least two respects. One, that it is anticipating a potential for disaster and recognizing the need for resources that in the event that it occurs, we are in a better position to fund the requisite course of action. But more importantly, this bill examines what is a real reality for the globe, and that we are rapidly affecting our environment, and some would argue irreversibly, and therefore we are worsening our chances as human beings by changing the temperature of our weather, thereby increasing potential damage for countries like the Bahamas and those in this region because of the frequency of hurricanes that are created due to this change in global temperature. Secondly, low-lying countries such as the Bahamas and others in the Caribbean are at risk for flooding. And based on what we experienced in Grand Bahama and in Abaco and in other islands at different times, if we do not act now to reduce the impact of greenhouse gases, what we are doing is essentially contributing to our own demise. And even though the Bahamas is not one of the major contributors to greenhouse gas emissions, we do have a voice in the global community. And those of us that have paid attention, some of us who have participated in those international meetings, we are always encouraged when we hear successive prime ministers on the international stage advocating for small island developing states, or as we prefer to say, big ocean states such as the Bahamas. And so it is important in advance of a catastrophic event for us to put in place a regime that allows us to generate revenue so that we are able to do several things. Put in place sensors so that we can anticipate climatic events that would affect us. Allow us to build predictive models so that we have a sense of what will the Bahamas be like after a potential category 1 or 2 or 3 or 4, that we can have resources in place to prepare public infrastructure inclusive of government buildings so that they are able to withstand any potential catastrophic event, to amend existing legislation as we did while in government, the Public Subdivisions Act, so that we are in a position to insist on better locations to build, better standards by which we should build. having resources is a prerequisite for us doing things in the legislative space, the policy space, and practically in terms of construction. In agriculture, if we are going to be effective in rebounding and achieving food security in the aftermath of climatic events, then we need climate-smart agriculture technologies and methodologies to help our people. And so on multiple levels, we see this as an important step in the right direction. It is a continuation, Mr. Deputy, of work that has been done before. The access benefit sharing legislation that was passed, some of you would recall, in fact, members opposite participated in the debate. The Biological Resources and Traditional Knowledge Bill of 2021 sought to establish a legal framework to provide for the protection and sustainable use of biological resources and traditional knowledge within the Bahamas, and to further enable the Bahamas to implement the Nagoya Protocols on Access Genetic Resources and the fair, equitable sharing of benefits arising from their utilization to the Convention on Biological Diversity. And simply put, we wanted to make sure that those genetic resources that reside within the Commonwealth of the Bahamas on land or in our marine environment would be used for the benefit of the Bahamian people. So this bill, similar to the Biological Resource and Traditional Knowledge Bill, was in part about monetizing our natural resources so that first and foremost, Bahamians can benefit from it. And so it is good that both administrations have adopted and prayerfully will in all of our, or the vast majority of our actions manifest it. First and foremost, it is about Bahamian ownership. The member for Angliston loves to say it is about protecting our patrimony. And we share that view. And so, Mr. Deputy, this is a continuation of that mantra, that it is important that we control the natural resources of our country. But this was not the only bill that was introduced over the last 4.5 years that was all about the business of ownership. Another bill focused on expanding the marine protected areas, what we call our MPAs. And let me say, for those fishermen, many of whom are presently deeply concerned about what some of them term in chat groups that I'm a part of, a relaxation on non-Bahamians fishing in Bahamian waters. Let me say that we have met with many of you and have made the point that the establishment of new marine protected areas ought to occur in consultation with fishers. And we believe that that ought to be the correct approach. And wherever any oversight exists, where that did not happen, you have a right, and I believe that this administration would move swiftly to revisit any MPA where there was not consultation. Our simple default position was there had to be a consultation with all stakeholders, those that derive their living from the marine environment, in addition to those non-governmental agencies and others who use the shared space, or that is near shore areas and other waterways. The marine protected areas is yet another example of natural resources that accrue benefit to the Bahamian people. As we talk about carbon sequestration, the marine protected areas is a perfect example of how successive governments over the last several administrations have gradually extended our protection of our marine environment to a minimum of 20% of our total marine environment. We are now en route to protecting 30% of our marine environment. And it is that massive space, to the tune of millions of acres, that enables us to engage in discussions with global environmental funds in order to ensure that they work with us as we continue to be good stewards of the global community. And in essence, in the Bahamas, we are contributing to the protection of our neighbors, near and far, by doing our part in pulling the harmful CO2 and other carbon-related minerals out of the air in order for us to help protect the environment, to lower the global temperature. And so CO2 is but one of them, and there are other harmful, rather than minerals, harmful gases, but we are playing our role through our mangroves, through our sea, through our forests. In many ways, we are functioning as the sink to pull these harmful gases out of the environment. And so there is monetary benefit, and that is why it is absolutely important for us to continue to put a value on our corals, a value on what is on and under the seabed, a value on the mangroves. All of these are extremely important because it allows us to more effectively engage in the discussion that we are engaging in today. I believe the National Trust, in its white paper that was released in 2018, made the point that there was, at least in their evaluation, some $5 billion in terms of value when you looked at the as you look at our mangroves, as you look at our grass beds. Those important assets in our near-shore marine protected areas value in the billions. And this is precisely why a Minister of Tourism and a Minister of the Environment and a Minister with responsibility for marine resources should hold accountable the cruise industry when it damages our seabed, and no leadership should capitulate to them in holding them responsible if we do our job in evaluating the value of what we have, the damage that they inflict, and the remedial costs or remediation costs associated with them setting right what they damage, whether through pollution or through anchors dragging on the bottom of our seabed. And so, again, this is about ownership, which is precisely why I caution the government that it, in all of its discussion thus far about this bill and the discussion about the carbon market, about the value of offsetting, the value of a voluntary and involuntary carbon market, there has been no discussion thus far in terms of the execution of this bill. So we've heard about a council being put in place that will be appointed by the Prime Minister that will provide technical advice, and we've heard about a management company. What concerns us are the following. One, most of the international contributions to this government in the past around environmental work, climate mitigation and adaptation, has been done when the government is working very closely in concert with non-governmental organizations. International agencies tend to be less trusting of central governments that find creative ways of moving resources earmarked to deal with environmental issues into their consolidated fund, or for a myriad of other initiatives. And the most non-governmental agencies, governments that are committed to providing funds to other national governments who recognize that these governments may be in the environmental fight, private foundations, they would rather spend their money with NGOs whose corporate governance structure they trust more than government. And where governments have benefited, as we have in the past, it is because a structure was put in place where there was clear transparency in the fact that the funds would be ring-fenced and targeted for particular environmental related stewardship initiatives. Unfortunately, I've not been able to glean how that is going to be executed through the management company that will be involved in the management of this particular initiative. And so that is a matter, I'm sure, in wrap-up that the governing side would comment on, because again, it seemed to me that the public needs to be clear. How is the public going to be the principal beneficiary of resources earned from their patrimony? And they would want to understand what percentage of all funds earned is going to a management company or is going to the people of the Commonwealth of the Bahamas by way of the Sovereign Wealth Fund. These are issues that I trust that the remaining speakers will be able to make clear. Again, we are very much in support of us monetizing our patrimony, as we have, again, contributed to in expanding the marine protected areas, in ensuring that we put in place legislation that protect the biological diversity of the Bahamas. One example we provided when we debated that particular bill was the Elizabeth Coral, where we found that there are universities, and I'm advised that the IDB report outlined that that we have issued some years 120 permits to professors globally who would come to the Bahamas. They would study some of and other research agencies, and many times they do not indicate that they are working in conjunction with multinational corporations or that they are applying for patents for any number of things that they are researching. And we would only find out in the aftermath of a patent having been issued or products having been created or a drug that is in its second trial, almost ready for release, that they benefited from some genetic material in the Bahamas. And so the legislation we put in place on looking at access benefit sharing was to mitigate against that. Again, all of those pieces of legislation that allow us to more fully take advantage of our natural resources is in our best interest, and both administrations ought to do, as we are doing today, work in tandem to make that happen. In education, for example, education is responsible for the UNESCO desk, and one of the things that is also important from a cultural standpoint, and for those of you that are in the cultural environment, this is a parallel to that effort in a sense, that in the cultural environment, there are many things that are uniquely Bahamian that we did not over time patent or protect so that Bahamians can, for future generations, benefit from those things. And so it is a wonderful thing now that the Bahamas is more fully moving in that direction, in that there are unique Bahamian practices, cultural expressions that we are seeking to patent as uniquely ours. One of the things that we do that's fairly unique, and we are no doubt looking at as a means of patenting, is just looking at the harvesting of cascarilla, the way in which we do the extraction, the way we beat the bark, for the whole process from in Michael, from the planting, the harvesting, the preparation, the extraction, etc. What along that continuum of activities is unique to us that we then ought to protect, patent, so that when others seek to utilize or to do the same, that they have to pay us some sort of royalty. And so with those words, I wish to say, Mr. Deputy, that we certainly support this bill, but we seek clarification from the government in terms of the management company. Is that the best model that we ought to use? And if so, what is the percentage of revenues generated under such an arrangement that is going to go to the Bahamian people. I'd also like to say that we, in a similar way, when we passed the fisheries bill, that was yet another attempt to protect Bahamian patrimony. In other words, it is very difficult for us to talk about the value of a particular Bahamian resource if we do not take the time to do a valuation. And so one of the things called for in the fisheries bill that is in place is that every marine species that we commercially harvest, the new fisheries bill now mandate that you must evaluate the size of the stock and then by extension the value of the stock to then determine whether or not we are able to give permits year-round or for part of the year or every other year in order for persons to harvest and to sell. So I love the fact that Bahamians are increasingly looking at every natural resource and seeking to figure out how do we protect it in the interests of Bahamians. So that the discussion on aragonite is not a discussion about harvesting raw material and sending it overseas and why can't I get one or two of those contracts, but that the discussion, while that discussion is important, it should be secondary to the discussion on what patents should we obtain for the transformation of aragonite into the wide range of products that can be produced for it. In fact, there is a Bahamian who presently have patents for aragonite, but most of their work is not done in the Bahamas, it's done overseas, because we are trapped internally in the Bahamas in a very parochial discussion around aragonite, when there should be a broader, far more sophisticated study. And it is my hope that your administration would move with some degree of urgency in liberalizing that particular market based on the science. In other words, studies have been concluded and we've determined what quantities are available. We are then in a position to say how many licenses ought to be allocated, and then we ought to move on it. We missed that opportunity, unfortunately. You don't have to miss it. And so let me also say that what has not been mentioned in this debate, but that is also relevant to this business of carbon sequestration and climate change, is insurance. And so I wish to raise, that has been raised in a previous discussion, we talked about CRIF. And we talked about the importance of the government paying its regular premium in order to benefit in the aftermath of a climatic event, benefit from funds so that we can rebuild. Well, what is also true for fishers, one of the discussions we participated in while in the Department of Marine Resources is the COAST program. And the COAST program, again, is but one example of one of the insurances that's very relevant now in this age of climate change. Whenever there's a climatic event, different sectors of our economy need insurances that would allow those practitioners in those areas to rebound and rebound fairly quickly. And so I end simply by saying that I believe we have a marvelous opportunity to collaborate on meaningful pieces of legislation such as this, and the Free National Movement stands with the government in this regard. Our only concern is in terms of transparency, and that we hope would be addressed. Mr. Deputy Speaker.
Thank you, Honorable Member from Marcus City.